what are some of the words that you think of when you think of a basement? Like, setting aside all of your knowledge, but like...
Oh, the scary ones. So creepy, dark.
Yeah, dark, dank, mysterious.
It's like being outdoors. I think for some people it feels like you're being outdoors. It doesn't have...
It's not a conditioned space in a lot of cases, especially in old houses. I mean, in newer houses, the basements were sometimes designed or, remade to be living spaces, like rec rooms or that kind of thing. Yeah. But they're underground.
They're subterranean in some cases.
Yeah. But they, like you said, they perform a really important function. Mm-hmm. I mean, your house can't exist without one. No. Not all houses have a basement. Some are built slab on grade and mechanicals are elsewhere in the house. But in a lot of old houses in particular, it's where the guts are. It's where the systems are. I mean, basements have ancient origins. I mean, people have been keeping valuable things in basements for a long time, whether it's food or the people who run their households. Yes. I mean, basements are really, in many ways, the engine of the house. So I think that it's important for people not to be scared of them, but to know when they're in the basement what to look for, what's important, what's normal, what is maybe something to be concerned about. So I think that's what we want to show.
Absolutely. You don't want your first experience going into a basement or going into a cellar to be at the moment where you have some kind of emergency that you have to deal with that's stressful in another way to begin with.
Right. I mean, how many times have you thought, well, if I had to run into the basement in the middle of the night because I could hear water spraying everywhere, would I know where the shut-off valve was?
It's so important. It's something I counsel people on multiple times a week.
Yeah.
Multiple times a week, my staff has a conversation with people about, this is where you do things like shut your water off. This is where you do things like shut off circuit breakers in a panel box. And the familiarity of that to start with before you've made that phone call where you have to deal with something that's an emergency, I think it makes the whole process of dealing with an emergency a little bit more effective or a little bit more efficient.
Right.
Have that baseline first, and then you're a warrior in solving your problem.
Totally.
And not a victim in a way.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I do think that's important.
Yeah. And then ultimately, I think we're going to talk about, well, when you do need professional advice, like who do you call? And so I think, again, every trade who's going to be involved in your house is at some point going to be in the basement.
Yes.
That's where your electrical is. That's where your boiler or your furnace, or usually it's all consolidated in the basement. Sometimes in the attic too. We'll get to the attic.
Yes, the attic has some
things. In another episode.
Sometimes the attic has things because of the type of foundation that you have.
Yes.
What your house is built upon, because the word is foundation really. What foundation the house is built upon impacts whether or not you can even consider a certain kind of renovation. So if you're gonna know your house and you're gonna understand your house, you have to start with the foundation. You just have to start from the beginning. Mm-hmm. You got to know the different kinds. Sometimes people have combinations of different kinds of foundations. Crawl spaces are, a lot of times crawl spaces were used in older homes because they were more cost effective. Mm-hmm. Excavation is difficult, or there was some kind of geological impediment. You'll have a mixture of crawl space slab on grade. Sometimes you'll just have a continuous crawl space under the entirety of the home. They require a little bit of different care than a slab on grade foundation. And then other times you have things like cellars, which were hand dug, stone built, meant to provide structural support, but also provide this climate controlled environment in older homes where people would store their food.
Which was really important. I mean, we forget how important that was at a certain time. So I think that I think it all goes to the point that we need to appreciate basements and not be scared of them. Although I want to ask you, what's your biggest fear in a basement? Snakes. Okay. Spiders for me.
Snakes and spiders. They're in there.
I know they're there.
They're in
but
there.
We have to coexist with them as long as they stay in their place and we stay
in ours.
It's all good.
The good news is we'll get to this once we are in a basement. We can illustrate some of the things about the way a basement foundation is constructed. there are little things that you can do to that space if it hasn't already been done that is effective at keeping pests, the bigger ones, out.
Yeah.
Sometimes the spiders are hard to control. The mice and the snakes and the
Spiders
bats.
are our friends. Even
They are,
admit
yeah.
that. Yeah.
So there are things we can do to kind of keep the pests and the varmints and critters out of our spaces, and also keep things like cold air from coming in.
Well, I think controlling airflow. I mean, controlling it, but we also need ventilation in basements.
Yes, we
so
do.
That's really important. Controlling moisture in basements is something that we can talk about. Pests, odors. I mean, that can be an issue in basements. I mean, these are all clues to things, just things to be attuned to, because they may be symptoms of other problems that you have, like poor drainage on your site, or maybe your gutters aren't working, or
yes.
Or maybe you do need to fill in some holes to create a tighter space in the basement. So I mean, I think that those are definitely considerations that one needs to have, and all the more important to know your basement. Go to the basement.
Let's go to the basement. Let's check for the critters first.
You go first.
You go first.
Here we are in the basement again.
Here we are in the basement of this beautiful 1800s house in Germantown, New York. It's a fantastic example of a couple of things from a structural perspective. First things first, this is a basement foundation. What would have been referred to, I think, and some people will still refer to as a cellar. 1800s house, hand dug. Generally speaking, they would construct houses like this using material that was readily available. Concrete block was not something that was utilized at that time. They would scour stone or excavate stone out of the ground, and they would use the stone as the source of their structural soundness.
Yeah.
So this is dry stacked stone, likely excavated from this property or somewhere around it. And from time to time, you see these spots here where there are gaps or there were openings in the stone. My guess would be at some point in the future, someone came along and parged in between these stones to close up openings.
Right, because originally this would have been laid dry, like no mortar in this wall, which I mean was truly an art.
Yes.
That there were stonemasons that did this every single day, because this was the way you built foundations. But yeah, so all of this is dry laid piece by piece, with bigger stones and then smaller stones filling in. And yeah, like you said, like later maybe somebody noticed that there was a trickle of water, or there was a mouse nest or something like that. So they tried to parge that, and this is even bulging a little bit, like it's not stick straight. So it probably was closer to straight when it was first built. But we're underground here, and so I know that there's a slope right outside here, and so there's all that pressure from the water and from the soil that has pushed this in a little bit. And we don't know if that happened 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 50 years ago. But, so we do keep an eye on it, but, it's not something that we're pulling our hair out, like we have to tear the whole thing down and start over. It's like it's not uncommon to see that, but it's definitely something to pay attention to. I mean, that there's moisture down here because you've got vines.
Yes,
growing
signs of life
from the outside. So it's like the outside is reaching in and trying to find water. So, it's a permeable.
It's permeable. It's almost living in and of itself.
Exactly.
To an extent.
Yeah.
And, to your point about this not being quite so plumb as it probably was when it was initially constructed, this wall, these exterior walls in any basement foundation or cellar foundation serve a structural purpose. It's a part of the skeletal framework of the house and the structural framework of the house. The weight of things on a house, everything from the exterior walls to the load of the roof, are carried back down through these walls
to the ground. Yeah.
So over the years, over the decades, and over the centuries, in the case of this house, you have many things playing a role in this. You have the work of moisture and the work of water moving something. You have the work of the earth around the outside of it, impacted by the things that took place since 1800, afterwards, maybe moving dirt and changing things, and also the load of the structure itself. It's almost like the feet. You know, it's like the legs and the feet, and they've been holding up this body for so long, and maybe they're getting a little tired and kind of giving in a little bit. But when somebody looks at a piece of real estate, they consider purchasing a piece of real estate, this may not necessarily be something that's cause for alarm. It's maybe something that you can investigate with a structural engineer just to confirm that this was built solidly, but 1800, and here we are, and we're still standing. Absolutely gorgeous way of constructing something, you know, an aside, absolutely gorgeous way of, you know, building this structure and kind of giving it foundation, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, that said, so it is permeable. There are, you know, definitely critters that get in here from time to time. There is definitely, you know, no standing water in the basement, although there's a corner over there that's like on the hillside, and that does get a lot of the runoff. So we've had to deal with exterior drainage to kind of keep the water from hitting that corner and getting into the basement. But, you know, this is probably a good candidate for having some sort of dehumidification, just because, you know, it is more humid down here. That said, you know, we have a gas boiler down here. It doesn't throw off a lot of heat like an oil furnace would.
Yes, it doesn't do much.
So that doesn't really help to dry out the air a lot. So it's, you know, it's something to, you know, you can get a very inexpensive thermometer or humidity monitor to tell you, you know, kind of what your humidity is.
Whether
and it should be like what, around like 50 or less.
I happen to set the dehumidifier in my very wet basement at the moment for about 50, between 50 and 55% relative humidity in the basement space. You want a little bit of humidity. You don't want to dry things out. You take the humidity away, you're going to do things that impact other structures. So you want a little bit of something. Some of the humidity, I think that's so common in a basement, has a lot to do too with what the floor is constructed
Right.
of.
I mean, here we've got a concrete floor that was poured on top of what was, I assume, originally a dirt floor. May have even had some wood on it, because you see like there's sort of layers. Maybe it had brick. This could have been a used space. I don't know that it was ever a kitchen. We don't have really any evidence of that. But, you know, there was a cellar, like an exterior door. You know, this is a pretty amazing circa 1800 door that we no longer have in use because it needs some restoration. But I mean, this beautiful like iron strapping and just the width of some of these boards is just like, this is priceless.
Yes, it's absolutely true to the use of what was around, the use of what was around people. And how things were so much more originally handcrafted in that case. Oh
yeah, you couldn't go to the hardware store and buy this door. Like somebody had to make this, you know, while they were building the rest of the house.
It's so terrific.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
But you do have evidence of plaster down here.
Yeah.
So, you know, some of these walls were finished. Maybe not this one, but some of the other ones. And so, yeah, I mean, this was a space that was part of the day-to-day life of the house, you know, that people were using more often than we use. I mean, we use it when we come down to service the boiler, you know, the water treatment system, you know, things like that.
Yeah, you have mechanical things that are in this space in its modern use.
Right.
And it's not so modern use. There's evidence of more than likely the centralized heating system, or some portion of the heating system, was located in this room.
Yeah.
Because there is a exit point for what probably was a chimney, maybe from the coal stove era.
Yeah.
Something of that, to that extent.
Yeah.
But then when these older spaces are repurposed, reutilized, modernized by the modern mechanical things that we run our household with, you have to marry the old with the new. And you have to learn how to work with the old, understand what its shortfalls are, kind of repair those shortfalls, make up for them. These spaces were, like you said, they were not watertight. They're not phenomenally airtight. Their climate condition can be problematic to the house. And through the years, as we've modernized things, we can bring in some of these new elements to an older basement and make changes that are better for the house overall.
Right.
The first thing is you have to get these things. So you have this beautiful subterranean space, and that subterranean space primarily can be used to take away from the square footage of the living space all of these mechanical items that we have here that help run the house. It's like the central nervous system, if you will. All of the electric from the mainline electric from outside. Sometimes electric service are overhead. Often here in the Northeast, we're going in an underground direction. Electricity comes into our homes in a subterranean way. When there's a basement, deep cellar foundation like this, a crawl space, or even a slab, they come in at the foundation level with electricity. And then somewhere along the line, we have in our basements the input from outside for things, like I said, electric, water, gas, if you're going to use gas for your heat, oil, if you still use oil for your heat. These items are located here. And that's how we've, from a modern perspective, started using this space to run the house. So maybe we should take a look.
All right, so when we rehabbed this circa 1800 house, it had electricity because people had been living here over the centuries, but we did upgrade the panel, the service. So I believe before it was 100 amp, which is, you still find 100 amp service in houses, but the standard is really 200 or more.
Yes, we need that kind of amperage in our homes now to use modern appliances. Modern appliances that utilize heat, things like dryers, when you have a clothes dryer, dishwashers, these things require a little bit more power. So
and they need, like, a lot of them need their own circuit. Like, the dryer is here. You've got the air conditioning unit,
hot water heater.
So all of those things that you didn't have in the 19th century but are just standard today, they all rely on electricity.
They do. Yeah. And this is like the brain. So if you look at the electricity in your house, almost like a central nervous system, you've got all of your wiring that goes everywhere, ends in these endpoints, the dishwasher, the clothes dryer, every outlet that you have, every light switch that you have. These things all originate back to this. This is the electrical brain of your house. And oftentimes the electricity itself that your house is being supplied with is coming in to a basement foundation, coming into a crawl space, coming into a slab on grade slab from outside. And this pipe, this lovely piece of 2-inch PVC pipe, is the electrical service making its way from the electric meter outside, originally making its way from overhead power in our case, coming through here and coming to the central nervous system before it's distributed into the brain, before it's distributed everywhere else in the house. Knowing where your panel box is, where your circuit breakers are, is important. In houses with basements, generally speaking, they were located here because they're not, it's not ideal to have this located above when everything else, if you look, this is the way in, this is the control, these are the wires out going to all the various places they need to go in the house. A basement foundation does a beautiful job of giving you access to everything above it in an open way. When this was originally constructed, or when you were going through the renovation before you did an insulation, this ceiling area was open, and you could literally touch the bottom of the first floor in the house. So you have all these places where you can drill holes and run wire. And so in many basement foundations, many crawl space foundations, you will find the input of electricity to the house. And in many cases, you'll find this control box that shuts the power off or turns the power on.
So there's the main breaker, right?
Yes.
So this is the main breaker, and you can tell it's 200 because it says 200 on it. So this will turn the power off to the whole house.
To the entire house, yes.
And then each of these individual circuits are for, if you're organized.
If they're labeled.
You'll have them labeled, or ask your electrician to label them all, so that, if a switch trips upstairs, like, you know, you're noticing you don't have power to your dishwasher or something like that.
Yeah.
You may have flipped the switch. So then you have to come down, figure out which one is for that appliance, and it'll have switched to the other side. So it'll literally be like that, and then you just have to push it back on. So you want to make sure that they're all lined up like that. I have seen in home inspections when the inspector will take this panel off and you see inside and all the guts of it. Oh my God. It's terrifying, and rightly so, because there's certain things that if you touch inside this, you will die.
Yes, there's so when you take the cover off, this is
so don't take the cover off without a professional.
Absolutely, don't be intimidated by looking at this as it is.
You can do whatever you want with these.
This is a control panel. It's like mission control. These many people through the years, as I've run the trade business that I've run, I know they have done things like paid electricians to come in. Outlet doesn't work. Bank of outlets don't work. Our electrical systems in our houses have these built-in sort of like overload protective mechanisms. Yeah. Sometimes they have outlets that have ground fault control interruption, and they'll trip because they sense too much load. Think about plugging a hairdryer in. I've done this. I have 5 kids. I have had to do this. I've had to plug a hairdryer in my kitchen while somebody was using my toaster. It's too much. You're asking for too much. And when you have an outlet that no longer works, you'll save yourself a lot of money if you run through the first steps that an electrician would run through. With the cover safely installed on this control box, it's completely okay to come down if labeled. Hopefully labeled. And I think the ultimate message is, if it's not labeled, look into having it labeled. You can come down and you can say, oh, you know what? The dryer's not working. You look at 19 and 20, because 19 and 20, yes, 19 and 21 are the clothes dryer here. And if you have glasses on and a little bit of light, these breakers have the word off in the off position, on in the on position. If you came down and you saw that this circuit, dryer's not working, I look at this, it's the dryer, it's in the off position, you may very readily be capable of solving your problem just by going like that.
Yeah.
And then if the problem persists, if you're always having to reset the breaker, that language is called reset the breaker. If you always have to reset the breaker when you use your dryer, you should probably look into having an electrician give you a site visit and see what might be going on with that.
Yeah, and see, we still have space on this panel, so if they needed to separate things into different circuits, like, you know, there's space that you could add new circuits, so that way you're not demanding so much of any one circuit at a time. But
these numbers have a meaning and they have a purpose. And those numbers are not just arbitrary numbers, they indicate the amperage of that circuit. So if you have a 200 amp service, you can start to add this up, 20, 40, 60. You can start to see where you may or may not have room in the amperage on each circuit. If you wanted to put a hot tub outside, for instance, that's a large draw. You consult with your electrician, have them come in here and see if there's any room in the amperage to add to this with this panel. If it isn't, don't fret. You don't necessarily need a bigger service. Sometimes you need something called a sub panel, and some houses have them. More modern houses often have sub panels, and it's literally one of these, smaller version, sitting right next to it.
Right.
And that's what you would see in the case of a sub panel. People with swimming pools, hot tubs, some air conditioning systems have a sub panel. And we'll move on to a more modern house, a newer house, where you can see what a generator transfer switch looks like and how that makes this look different. But here in this house, I think the mainstay thing to understand is that our electricity is coming in subterranean, and this is where its centralization takes place. So that's the basement electrical story. Pole outside. When you look at this basement and you see this floor, there are some clues going on here. And whenever in my trade, which in my water treatment company, if I ever wanted to kind of guess where a well might be located, if it wasn't obvious outside, you can look at the entry point for these things. It stands to reason that if this were constructed in a common sense way, you can assume that the source of electricity is somewhere in this corner of the yard. It's overhead, so it's somewhere running along the road in this corner of the yard if you walked out of the house. The well is likely located somewhere in this part of the yard also. Where these things come in are clues as to where they live out there.
Right. And something that I've learned is that the well, which is out front right there, is on the opposite side of the house from the septic.
Important.
Because you don't want your well and your septic to be next to each other.
We do not want these things
Sometimes
commingling.
they're closer than others, but in this case, the well is off the front of the house and the septic goes off the back that way.
And we do have, septic and sewer and drainage also take place in basements. They take place on slab and grade foundations, where they're literally buried in the slab floor, and everything originates under a house and goes out to wherever the exit point is. The same is true of the water. These things, electricity, these things come into the slab underneath it and then up through penetrations in the floor instead of penetrations in the walls. And that's how a slab on grade foundation would work. This is an example of what sewer pipe looks like, which is often located either through a slab or in a crawl space. This is a main line. We're illustrating a 3-inch PVC pipe, which is a main line that exits out to the sewer, if you have a municipal sewer, or to a septic system if you have a septic system in your yard. And generally speaking, there will be some exit point. The exit point is typically indicative of where the beginning of your septic things or your sewer connections are out in your yard. So if you're looking for a clue to the location of those things, then you can follow that pipe, if you're in a crawl space or you're in a foundation, to its exit point through the wall, and more than likely you're going to find those things.
So usually the septic tank, if you have a septic system, the
Yes.
septic tank's going to be a few feet beyond the foundation of the house outside.
Yes,
and
generally
in the
speaking,
direction of
that
that
exit
pipe.
point is it's like an arrow.
Yeah.
Pointing to that stuff out in the yard.
Because some people don't know where their septic tank is.
Oftentimes, as a house passes through and passes hands, or changes hands, that stuff kind of gets lost in the sauce. If they've never had to dig up the septic system, or they've never had to dig up the tank and clean the tank or do anything with the leach field, they don't know where these things are. And it wasn't customary until recently, really, to maintain mapping of those systems.
This is where your true expertise comes in when it comes to anything related to water. You know so much about houses in general, but water is your true love.
My niche. It was my first love.
So I'm just going to follow you around while you tell us about the different parts of a water system in a house. And in this case, we've got a number of different appliances related to that. But we also did a basement talk in a different property a few years ago. And so we can link to that so that people can get all water all the time.
But initially, just from our global viewpoint, this particular house has well water. So I think right now, 45% of American households source their water from wells, and 55% of American households have city or municipal water that they pay for from a village, a town, or a private company. In this case, this house has a well, and the well it's somewhere over there, as we discussed before, and the pipe comes in from outside from the deep well. The deep well has a pump inside of it. The pump is not in the house. It's actually in the ground, in the well. The very first thing you have when you have well water this is called a pressure tank. Some people will refer to it as a water tank. This is the water delivery control system. Well pumps need a trigger to understand when they should turn on and when they should turn off. In the case of this particular house, submersible well pump, it doesn't run all the time. It doesn't run immediately when you open a faucet. It runs when it needs to. And this tank is here to decide when it's time to tell the pump in the ground to turn on. The way that it makes that decision is this tank, if you hear it, when I knock on it, it's empty up top. It's full in the bottom portion. This is a tank that has a bladder inside of it. Air is on the top, applying pressure downward on the water. The water comes in from outside and passes through this T. fills a portion of this tank at the same time as it is passing. This switch, there's one of your dead spiders who's left us. This is a pressure switch. This switch, which does have live electricity in it, has a diaphragm on the underside. This is not something to touch. That's hot live electricity. It has a diaphragm attached it's attached to the water supply by this threaded brass nipple. When the water comes in, some of it fills this column, puts pressure against that diaphragm. When it's filled to the point where it's reached the appropriate amount of pressure, which in your case is going to be 50 pounds, then this switch opens the contacts. When it opens the contacts, it shuts the power off to the pump. No more water. Now you've got this little bit of pressure that's filling all the pipes in the house. When you start to use water, that pressure is relieved. The pressure is relieved on that threaded brass nipple. It closes the contacts on this switch, turns the power on to the well pump so that it starts pumping water in. That's how a submersible well pump will deliver water to the inside of your house. Oftentimes, these pressure tanks are located in basements. Oftentimes they're located in crawl spaces of a certain height as well, because these tanks can come in different sizes. Generally, they're squatty enough that you can fit it in a crawl space. Because the water comes in from a low point in the wall, they would be located in the basement. And then you have all the distribution of all of the household piping that comes from this central location. One of the stops that water needs to make is to some machine that's going to make it hot. And in some houses, that machine is an electric fired. This is an electric fired hot water heater with a storage tank. Some houses have coils on an oil fired boiler. Some houses have on-demand fired hot water tanks, and they're boxes mounted to the wall. But generally speaking, this is one stop this water will make. The cold water comes out of the well, a branch of it goes into the hot water heating method, and then exits the hot water heating method hot. So in a domestic plumbing situation, you always have cold side, hot side, cold water pipe, hot water pipe. And it's generally running all along a basement ceiling and then making a penetration upward to do things like feed hot and cold water to your kitchen faucet, to your toilet, to your bathtub, to the outside faucets. Oftentimes these pipes will make a penetration at this high point, which is called a sill plate, outside, and that's where the outside spigot originates from, like going through that sill plate.
And in the old copper pipes, you didn't necessarily know which was the hot and which was the cold.
No, you didn't.
But how long ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago, they started using PEX, P-E-X.
And they made it nice and...
They made it nice and color-coded. One thing that I want before we get further down the line is, so if you needed to shut the water off in this house...
If you needed to shut the water off in this house, you go to this central location that we just taught you. This is where the water's coming in, right? You go to this central location, and there should be a shutoff valve on that. This is the house side after the water's gone through this tank. There is a shutoff valve here, easy enough to turn. It's a 90-degree valve. Open, usually goes in line with the pipe. Closed, seems to build a dam against it. A lot of times these handles have an on and an off. It just happens to be a little dirty and you can't see it here. An on, an off, and an arrow that indicates. So the arrow would indicate that you turn it on by going in that direction. You turn it off by going in this direction. This is a really neat. It's a drain. It's designed for a plumbing professional or a mechanical contractor to drain the contents of this tank, but it's also a source of water that you can put a hose on and you can use down here in the basement. Mm-hmm. It's a pressure gauge so that you can see what pressure is on this tank. And that is a pressure relief. So I'm sure this has happened more than once. I'm sure this has happened more than 1,000 times that people have come down into their basement. Basements are flood spots. There's water, a lot of water going on here. This is a pressure relief valve. If for some reason well switch is stuck in the on position and the pump is pumping, but nobody's using water, this is a relief valve that's designed to relieve all of that pressure, and it will leak water until it hits the point where the pressure is relieved. So if you're wondering where the source of your water is in your house and you have well water, this is where it all starts. When do you call a professional? All right, so there's many layers of when you call a professional. If you have no water in your house, you can refer to, obviously, the video that we're going to link in with the more detailed stuff. But the very first thing that you should be considering if you have no water in your house is coming to this pressure gauge. Do that first and foremost. This was a 40-60 switch. You can take this switch off, and that is right in the label. Pump turns on at 40, shuts off at 60. If you come to that pressure gauge, assuming the pressure gauge is working properly, and there is anything less than 40 pounds pressure on that pressure gauge, then you know your no water or low water problem is related to the water delivery system.
Which would be the pump in the well.
Could be the pump, could be this switch, could be this tank.
Okay.
But it's something related to the water delivery. That's when you would seek the help of a professional that works in that particular business. And depending on the region, there are pump professionals that only drill wells, only install well pumps, only install pressure tanks. In other regions, sometimes that's a plumber. It falls under the umbrella of that.
Mm-hmm.
Hot water issues oftentimes falls under the umbrella of a plumber, or falls under the umbrella of a HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning professional or mechanical contractor. If you have no hot water, one of the most important things I've taught my staff to ask is two things. Is it that you have no hot water, literally not a drop of hot water coming out of the hot side of a faucet, or is there water coming out of it but it's cold? Those very different things that require the help of two different groups of contractors. That's when you can utilize the skill. First, if you have no hot water, no water's coming out, then you have to consider it's a delivery issue. The water's not getting there, it's not coming out.
So somehow your hot water storage tank is empty.
Yes,
yeah.
It's empty, or
it's been drained by
something.
Yeah.
Yes, there's an impediment of some kind. No physical water coming out is typically plumber's world. Not a water delivery guy's world. It's a plumber's world. If the water itself is not hot, that may have more to do with the fuel that's used to heat it.
Mm-hmm.
If that fuel is electricity, check your panel box, make sure the breaker didn't trip. If that fuel is gas, make sure you have enough gas in your gas tank. If that fuel is oil, make sure you have enough oil. And then if you find that those usual suspects, those first things that you should check into are not the problem, then you go to those individual people. If it is no hot water, physically not hot, and it's an electric fired appliance, you may want to consult an electrician. If it is no hot water and that appliance is fired by gas, you may want to reach out to a gas contractor. If it's no hot water and it's fired by oil, then you may want to have a conversation with the company that comes and services your oil burner.
So the two simplest explanations I've ever encountered for no hot water is somebody turned off the switch at the top of the basement stairs.
Yes.
Or there's no power either in the house or even town-wide because maybe there was a storm or the power's out. So if the power's out, even if you're on oil, like your boiler's not going to work or your furnace is not going to work, right, or your hot water heater's not going to work. So both are power issues, but both are not necessarily a reason to call a contractor, because one, you may be able to switch flip the switch back on, or you may just have to wait till the power comes back on.
Exactly. When power is out in a country home, in a country or environment, and power is out, the water won't work either. Many of the systems that are in our basements or in our houses are dependent in some way on electricity. Boilers need electricity to fire their control valves. So when there's no power in your house Short of using gas for a gas stove, most of the time you will not have the means to use water. You won't have hot water. You probably will not have heat. More than likely, you will not be able to cook.
Or flush the toilet.
Or flush, yes, all these things. Don't flush the toilet. But there are these usual suspects that outside of that, to recap, look at the global things. Is there a local or regional power outage? Did somebody flip the convenient switch that's located at the top of the basement stairs and shut off your hot water heater or shut off your oil-fired boiler? Did someone forget to turn the water on in the house? Did someone do work on the hot water heater and forget to turn the water back on? Is the circuit breaker tripped? These are those usual suspects that a professional is going to cross off the list first and foremost before they start digging into something more complex. Our well water here in the northeastern part of the country usually is deep sourced. Our wells are 200, 300, 400 feet, and the water quality is not always the best.
It's like you never know. It's like a crapshoot.
It is an absolute crapshoot. My company exists because most of the time there's something wrong. The idea of beautiful, pristine well water that's fantastic and doesn't need some kind of remediation is rare. Water issues can cause problems with water using mechanicals, with boilers, with hot water heaters, all kinds of things. So very often in a basement where there's well water, and sometimes in a basement where there's municipal water, there will be some kind of water treatment or remediation equipment centrally located, because this is the point of entry where the water comes into the building. So in this case, here we have a handful of things. The water here happened to be very smelly. It had an extremely high pH. So in this particular house, we have a sulfur treatment system, a machine that's designed to lower pH, a sediment filter, and an ultraviolet light to kill bacteria. These things...
And a water softener.
Yeah, the salt barrel to the
that's
machine that lowers the
that's
pH.
actually not a water softener. That is for the pH machine.
Yes, that's a machine that lowers pH.
Because you often will see that kind of salt container connected to a water softener as well.
A beautiful illustration of either a machine that lowers pH or a machine that would soften water, remove iron, or remove manganese. And they do have salt containers. They require some maintenance occasionally. But the overall gist of this is all centralized here, so that every drop of the water that's used in the house, before it begins to distribute off to all the places it goes through this machine, is corrected before it reaches the point where it's used. And there are things to do with this equipment. Maintenance, things like setting clocks in the event of power outages. There are shutoffs in the event of leaks. There are other series of shutoff valves that can be used to isolate specific sources of water upstairs. These things are all kind of going on in a basement. They can sometimes be going on in a crawl space, depending on how tall the crawl space is. In many cases, these items, with the exception of the well tank, oftentimes you'll see hot water heaters, water treatment equipment located somewhere above the crawl space so that you can fit standard size equipment in, so that it's accessible for service. These things wouldn't be found in a crawl space. They'd probably be found in some kind of mechanical room in the house.
Right, because they have to be vertical in order to work.
They have to be vertical in order to work. They become more expensive when they become oddly customized for size. In the case of a hot water heater, the smaller they get, the lesser capacity for hot water you have. Sometimes you'll find 2 or 3 small ones dotted throughout a basement. If a basement or a house is very large, oftentimes basements get very large when houses are situated all on one story. So you may see a couple of these downstairs so that you're not trying to heat water in a place that's 65 or 70 feet away from the hot water heater. Just plunk another one there. So you may have 2. But this is where the water in this house does its thing. The other thing that oftentimes comes in subterranean, or comes in a crawl space, or comes in a slab, is gas. If you have either natural gas or you have propane gas in your home to provide heat, to provide fuel for cooking, to provide fuel for your clothes dryer or for a boiler, gas line is generally run underneath the house, and then the line is run all along the floor and then up through the floor to the location where it's going to terminate, such as the stove. What you're looking at there in this basement is a propane gas manifold. The gas comes in from this beautiful black iron pipe. The gas tank is likely located somewhere in that part of the yard. It comes in from the gas tank outside and it goes into this manifold. And each of the individual places that are going to be serviced by that gas are represented by one of those pipes. The shutoff valves for the gas service to those individual places are on that manifold. So if you need to shut your gas off for whatever reason, you think you may have a gas leak. If you think you may have a gas leak, one of the first things you should absolutely do, I know here in our area, this is something that is the responsibility of our utility company. In some places, it's the responsibility of a gas company. Call who you are supposed to call. Leave the house, call who you're supposed to call to manage a gas odor. There are different things in different areas. Here in New York, we call our utility providers. It's their responsibility. But if somebody were to be coming just to do work on something, like for instance, you're replacing your stove, and your stove is a gas stove, in this house, that manifold is constructed so that you can shut the gas off to just the stove while that service work is taking place, and you will still have gas to the other locations.
Yeah, because in this house, we've got a gas cooking stove, we have a gas heating stove, and we have the gas boiler.
Yes, there's three. That makes perfect sense. There are 3 locations that gas is distributed out of that manifold, but that's there to be the central location for the fuel sources for those 3 appliances. And this is the very fabulous, gorgeous gas boiler. Beautiful, modern, energy efficient gas boiler, and all of the control and management of the hot water that's produced by the gas boiler and then effectively fed. This is hot water that is recirculated. It is not hot water that is drawn constantly. Rather, there's water that fills this loop of pipe that goes to a baseboard or goes to a hydrocoil or goes to a radiator, whatever you have in your house that actually diffuses the heat is filled with hot water that's manufactured by this boiler, and it keeps coming back. Once that water's not so hot anymore, it's constantly traveling in a circle. It's going out, making the room warm, coming back into the boiler, getting reheated, and that process is controlled by these valves. So that is something that's going to very often be located in a basement. One of the most important things about a basement, I can't tell you how much money is wasted annually by someone incidentally thinking that this was a light switch.
Yes, that's the switch that when it is, I think, rather poorly placed at the top of the basement stairs.
Yes.
That it's so easy just to reach in and like just flip whatever switch you feel, and sometimes it's the boiler
It's the boiler
switch.
one. So they put this, most of the time when done well, there's going to be a light cover, a switch cover on there that indicates that it's not a light switch, it's the boiler switch.
Yeah, a red switch, think twice before you turn that on or off.
Yes. Now, some people's emergency switches are located at the top of the stairs. I built a house and subsequently sold that house, and one of the issues that came up in the inspection was I had not located that at the top of the stairs.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes the desire behind locating them at the top of the stairs is that if there's a fire in the basement, you have the ability to shut the potential source of fuel for the fire off without having going into the space.
Okay.
So that's why they're at the top of the stairs. But they are so mistaken. They are mistaken across the world wide as light switches all the time. It's dark in the stairwell. It's dark.
Well, and what I love about these systems with all of those switches, I mean, it's like being in the control room of a ship.
It is.
It's like, it's really beautiful. I mean, when it's done well, like this one was, it's just the copper, and then it really is kind of wonderful. I mean, in this house, what we have is radiant floor heat. So we don't have like cast iron radiators like you might expect in an old house. But what we did is we had the opportunity to put basically the coils, the water tubes that recirculate exactly, with the hot water. It goes underneath the floor and and just heats the floor from underneath. So the whole floor becomes a radiator. Yeah, and it's a really lovely heat. Because your feet are always warm. It's we have under the old wood planks of the floorboards. So it's a little bit more complicated to make sure that you're heating the mass of wood versus like tile or concrete or something like that. But for us, it works really well. The one sacrifice that we made is that because all of those heating tubes are in what we would be able to see them except for this insulation, but we want to direct the heat up.
Exactly.
So you don't want to heat the basement.
Right.
You want to heat the floor upstairs. So we had to put insulation, this rigid foam insulation, and seal it. So if we didn't do that, you would be able to see the full width of these beams and the underside of the floorboards. So that was just
to make a heated pocket. So it's like a little pocket of heat.
And
protecting it by holding it in
that
with
reflects
foam.
the heat upwards into the living space.
Yeah. So yes, radiant heat manufactured by hot water gas boiler.
Often you can tell a lot about the framing of a house by looking at the basement. Yeah. So here you've got these, some of these, not all of them, some of them are hand-hewn beams that are original to the house. This basement's a little bit of a mystery because the beams are not that substantial. They're definitely spaced far apart. You wouldn't see this in new construction. It's done the job for a couple of centuries, but you've got these adjustable columns that are just sort of supporting the beams, which suggests that there was probably some deflection, some bounce in the floors, and they just stuck that in to support it. If you had a home inspection right now, the home inspector would tell you, like, you should replace that with an actual steel column, a permanent column. But yeah, this is definitely, that's sort of the thing about all homes, is that once they're built, they're already obsolete when it comes to code, because codes change all the time. Yes. So these old houses, there's no way you can talk about, are they up to code? Codes moved on, decades ago. Yes, but the question always is, like, is it performing? And in this case, this structure, as underbuilt as it is performing.
Sure. So. This wood, as it gets older, gets stronger. It gets beautiful when it gets old. But yes, and you can see some things that happened through the years where they probably were attempting to make up for some structural issues and a little bit of sag, using, that kind of looks like an old telephone pole. Yeah. Using that to hold up and provide some support. In new construction houses, oftentimes what you have with a column, like a metal column like this, or any sort of column, is it doesn't just hold up something structurally. It translates to a construction under the basement floor. Their poured concrete and concrete block foundations have footings. The footings are the concrete structure that's underneath the concrete walls and the concrete floor that ultimately bear the end of the weight burden or the structural burden. So a column like this in a new construction house is going to translate to something underneath the floor that bears the weight. And, oftentimes if they started to have a sag in the floor upstairs, or felt a sag in the floor, this was a way to pop it back up.
Right. And I would imagine that some of what's going on over here is that this is that corner that I talked about is built into the hillside and catches water. That we had to do some exterior drainage work to keep, it was much wetter before. And you can see, I don't know, this wall bulges also. A lot. Yeah. So it's like there was a lot of pressure behind there from water. It's entirely possible. I know when we did the rehab of this house, we had to kind of excavate out a lot of the sill, so that wood beam that kind of goes around the whole perimeter of the house, that the frame of the house rests on. So it sits on top of the foundation. So that was very old wood, but after time, it had rotted out. And so we had to replace a lot of that to reinforce the structure of the house.
Yes, that board, that wood beam that sits on top of a foundation wall, be it a slab on grade, be it a crawl space, be it a full foundation, being an old cellar, it's called a sill plate. It's literally the sill the house is built on, and it's where the structural part of the foundation meets the structural part of the construction of the house. And oftentimes in houses and basements, you will see where that's being insulated because it's a huge source of air loss and heat loss in the house. And here you can see an illustration of some insulation around these portions that will make their way outside. This basement has a great example of some water management that you might find in a lot of basements, especially in wet areas. It's not impossible to construct a basement in a wet place. You just need to take into consideration that you may get water in it from time to time, and you have a way of managing it. And in this case, there's a sump pit and a pump. And when the water level rises in this basement up to a certain level, it triggers that pump to come on, and the floor will be pitched so the water will roll into the pits, and then the pump pumps it outside. Generally speaking, the water gets pumped outside, sometimes to storm drains or footing drains that are designed to move water away from the footing part of the foundation, which is the structural part that the basement wall actually corresponds to in the ground. These systems are designed to keep water out of the basement, and oftentimes really useful and important when you have a storm, or if it's springtime, wet season, rainy season. If you get water in your basement, it's important to know if you have a sump pump, and it's important occasionally to make sure that it's working properly and to give it a little test run. And one of the best ways to give it a test run is to come down with a bucket. You can use, like we illustrated before, you've got this fantastic source of water in this house here that corresponds to the pressure tank. Fill the bucket with water and keep filling the pit until it gets full enough, and see if the pump comes on and pushes the water out.
Yeah.
But definitely test it. You want to know that it's working before the hurricane.
Well, in this case, it pumps it up that pipe directly into the sewer line. So in this house, we're on municipal sewer.
Oh.
So it goes up into that pipe there, and then down, and then out into the municipal sewer. Another thing that we have down here is a dehumidifier.
Yes.
So it's running pretty constantly because, this basement, we sometimes have had standing water down here, hence the sump pump. But you can tell just by the foundation that this is not a structural wall. This is just like a divider between the parts of the basement. But the brick, because brick is a porous material, it has absorbed water over time and basically just crumbled. So we knew that this was a wet basement, or at least somewhat humid basement.
Moist,
so we
damp.
knew that a dehumidifier was a good appliance to have. And what's good is that we had the electrician install an outlet there so we could plug it in, and then we can drain it directly into that sump pit.
So you don't have to empty a bucket.
Nope.
It's terrific. It's good to not have to empty a bucket.
Yeah.
Anything you can do that creates low maintenance situation is the way to go. Everybody's gonna forget to empty the bucket. This basement has a beautiful example of a different kind of heating system in it as well. This basement has an oil-fired boiler, and that oil-fired boiler has the fuel tank for it located here in the basement. This is a home heating oil tank located directly in the basement. Depending on the law in the region you live in, this may be outside. Just depending still on the laws in the region you live in, it may be underground. But here in New York, we locate them in our basement. So this is an oil tank. Somewhere corresponding to this tank outside on the exterior wall of the house is the fill that the oil company uses to hook the hose up and fill your tank.
And we can see, this is a good thing to know, is your fill level on your oil tank. So that red floater,
Yeah, it's like a float.
yeah,
Doohickey.
Yes. So this indicates that we have between 3/4 and a full tank. So that's a decent amount of oil to start the heating season off with. But you want to keep an eye on that, because unless you're on, even if you're on automatic delivery with your oil, you want to, because your use may change depending if it's really cold.
Exactly.
You may use more oil in a particular period. So it's a good idea to come down and check that every once in a while and make sure that you know that you have a decent amount of oil in your tank. Because if you run out and have to call for an emergency delivery during the blizzard, then and it's no fun. Or if you find that you have no hot water, it could be because you ran out of oil.
The other thing that don't let it get too low. The other thing you want to do is make sure that if you don't have automatic delivery, that they're coming to fill the tank before it gets below 1/4 of a tank, because at the bottom of an oil tank over the years is a lot of sludge and solids. And if you run out of oil, this is another strong argument against running out of oil. When they fill the oil tank, they kick up all the sludge and all the solids. They end up in your lovely boiler, and they start clogging little tiny orifices, nozzles, and holes. And then you've got a boiler service or a boiler repair issue on your hands. So the rule of thumb is go down in the basement occasionally, check out this stuff.
Yeah.
Check out your sump pump, make sure that it tested occasionally, it's pumping the water out. Check your oil fill gauge. Oil tanks are most often the type of fuel tank that you'll find in the basement. Propane tanks are not allowed inside the building, so if you have propane, that's not going to be in your basement. If you use geothermal, that comes from wells that are in the ground outside. So it's if you have oil heating your home or heating your hot water, check the tank occasionally.
Yeah. I mean, and one thing that we should talk about, when I've definitely had that situation where the boiler kicks off and won't come back on, and it's because of exactly what you talked about. There's some sort of oil goop that's clogged up part of the system, so it's turned itself off just to protect itself.
Yes.
And then you don't have heat. And so, there is a restart button that I know about. There are different things that you can try. I think the most important thing is to make sure that you have your boiler serviced annually, because they'll clean out all the filters and all the nozzles and everything, and make sure that it's running efficiently, because it's all, if you are still on oil, which a lot of houses still are, you want to make sure that your boiler is running as efficiently as possible.
Exactly. I think it's a fair question to ask your boiler service professional as well. At what point do I try, if I have no heat, at what point do I try something on my own? Like check that switch that we discussed that's often located at the top of the stairs. How many times can you press that reset button?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's important. It's usually only one time. So invest some time in talking to the boiler service professional about what he or she recommends you do first before you call for service. It could be something simple, and then you don't need a professional's help and a professional's bill. After you try these couple of things correctly, then you need to call.
So here is the light switch that turns the light on and off. This is the boiler switch. So if by accident that gets turned off, you're not going to have heat, you're not going to have hot water. You just have to make sure that it's on. Some of the plaster. So here are those tubes that branch off and go underneath the floorboards, and then they've been wrapped to kind of help them retain heat as they travel from the main part of the basement into this crawl space, which is underneath the the dining room and the kitchen of the house. And up, we can see some daylight through there. So some holes in that dry laid stone foundation.
A little bit of the daylight, so that's sometimes where we get our critters and our little house guests from.
And I know for a fact, because I've been underneath there installing the heating tubes, is that is a dirt floor under there.
Wow.
So I know in many cases people would recommend putting some kind of plastic sheeting down to prevent, the kind of the rising of moisture from the dirt to the underside of the floor, just because it protects your framing and you're not going to get the transmission of humidity and odors and things like that from the basement.
There are some benefits to using visqueen vapor retardation on a dirt floor for sure. It's easy, it's accessible to use. There's also in any sort of newer construction, newer within the last 40 years, underneath the floor or underneath a slab, there likely is visqueen vapor retarder obviously to stop the vapor from water vapor or moisture, but if it's the correct thickness, that plastic can actually prevent radon from penetrating into a basement. It's got a lot of benefits. It's a nice, easy, inexpensive way to prevent vapor and sometimes, depending on how thick, radon from coming into a basement.
Yeah, but this is a true crawl space, because you have to get on your hands and knees or your back and kind of squirm around to operate under there. And really the only thing that's under there are the heating tubes for the radiant floor heat. But this was an addition to the house. So the house was originally built in 1800, and this addition with the dining room and the kitchen was put on in probably the 1860s. So to your point, they weren't going to the trouble of excavating a full basement because they already had a full basement. They were just having a crawl space so that the house was not sitting directly on the ground. But it's a crawl space that's created by a sort of a 2-foot high dry laid stone foundation and a sill and frame and floor framing.
Yeah, so that's oftentimes a reason in a home that's older that you'll see combinations of basement type through the years and through the incarnations of the house.
So did you have fun down there?
I had fun down there. No snakes.
No, there weren't snakes. And only dead spiders.
Dead spiders. This was a great basement experience. You gotta go down that little bit of a scary stair. Well, but once you learn, going down there again the second time isn't quite so scary, right?
And as old house basements go, that one's not so bad.
No, that one's not bad. Somewhere along the line, I think probably somebody decided to put poured concrete for a floor, which makes it so very helpful. It's not wet because you've done the work to excavate like around the outside and keep the water. But it makes me think about when you walk downstairs in a basement, there's a representation down there of so many different trade companies and trade workers that people might want to build a relationship with as they own a home or as they begin to establish understanding their home.
Well, and I think that you made the important point of not every problem needs a phone call to a professional. So there's some basic checklist things that you can run through for yourself to get a little bit closer to diagnosing the problem before you pick up the phone. But then there are other things where you really do, you need to know who to call.
Yes.
And it's not just one guy, it's not just one handy person, it's a variety of different trades who all have different expertise that you should, as you say, develop a relationship with.
So trade work in particular, I think it takes a lifetime, depending on what your niche trade work is. It takes a lifetime to truly understand all the different things in that particular trade or in that genre that might impact a house. But ultimately, like a handyman, one guy does it all kind of guy, isn't always going to be able to diagnose the subtle things, or isn't always going to be able to assess or ascertain whether the system that you have is the best way to be doing something. In the basement downstairs here in this beautiful old house, I can see why somebody would need to want to develop a relationship with an electrician an HVAC or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning contractor or mechanic, a plumber, a well driller, a framing contractor, and an insulation trade professional, because that's a niche in and of itself.
Right.
And when you break down plumbing, sometimes it's important, and depending on the region that you're in, plumbers that come and work on water leaks or installing a water using appliance may not necessarily clean a clogged drain pipe. That's a niche in and of itself. So you've got plumbers that work on domestic pipe, you have plumbers that work on hot water heaters, and you have plumbers that work on drain and septic systems. So even they specialize. Depending on your region, the basement's a great place to start to get to know who you might want to develop relationships with in your town.
Right, and knowing what questions to ask them to really understand what their area of expertise is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think the more knowledgeable you are as a homeowner, the better that relationship is going to be, because they're going to realize that first you care, and that you're curious, and that you really want to partner with them to do what's best for your home.
Yes, exactly.
And I know that one thing that so we have a great plumber who we've worked with on this house, but he has been very clear that he doesn't do water treatment. So water treatment, which is your expertise,
my area of expertise,
is something that I'm so glad that we have a relationship, because I've learned so much about it from you. And it wasn't something that my plumber was able to help me with, but he was very forthright about the fact that you need somebody who specializes.
Exactly.
In that.
And to your point, as someone's developing a relationship with a professional like that, the professionals that will serve you best are the ones that are open-minded to educating. My company offers a service where when a person takes ownership of a home where I may have installed water treatment equipment, at no charge, we come and we will help you understand what the equipment is in and of itself, what it's there for, how to maintain it, how to care for it, and when you need to call us versus when you need to take care of something for yourself. If you're interviewing a trade professional or you're looking for trade help, if you don't feel like you're getting that open relationship from that person, we're going to have to cut it out. Okay. If you feel like you're not getting that kind of open relationship with the electrician that you're reaching out for, they don't seem to take care or take time to help educate you, that might be an indicator that it's worth looking at someone else. It shouldn't be in the dark kind of mystery stuff.
Right, totally agreed. And I really appreciate professionals who have developed a system for being able to take phone calls, schedule service calls, be there when they say they're going to be there, so that you can have those conversations, because unfortunately there are a lot of people who you kind of feel like you're chasing them around.
Exactly.
And you never get to have that FaceTime with them. So I think it's really important to look for people who come with great recommendations, who are who show up when they say that they're going to show up, who are willing to spend time and have the conversations with you. And that's what there's so many out there who are just great professionals in that regard. So if you're having trouble connecting with a tradesperson, look for other recommendations.
Yep. Best thing to do is to ask around and get a basement battalion or a basement brigade.
I love that, basement battalion.
Get a
We
battalion.
should write that on the chalkboard. Right
Yep,
there.
get a battalion of people together that are going to take care of all of your basement things. Get down in there and look around. Don't be afraid.
Yeah.
It's just as much a part. If it's not the most important part of your house, it's just as much a part of the house.
Yeah, and I think that again, it's where a lot of problems start. And if we
Sorry, it's going.
Need coffee.
Yes, a little bit. Okay, it's where a lot of problems start.
It's where a lot of problems start. So if you can, be a little bit knowledgeable to kind of get out in front and diagnose those, and then know who to call, and have that team together. I think you are going to be in such a good place when it comes to home stewardship. And let's face it, houses are
huge investments.
Mhm.
You can't go to sleep on these things.
No, and an educated and informed customer, as an owner of a trade business and someone I've worked in the trades my entire adulthood, I don't need necessarily an explanation that would be equivalent to having somebody sitting next to me that knows exactly what I know. I don't need it to be to that extent for me to do my job well, but having just at least a phone call with a person who's got a basic working knowledge. I get phone calls very often in my industry about people having no water. No water, like turn the tap on, nothing comes out. Under those circumstances, it could be any origination. It could be a well pump issue. It could be a pressure tank issue. It could be a filtration issue. The filtration is my scope of work. I have to discern on the phone with somebody which one of those issues it is so that I can figure out if I can fix it or tell them they need to call someone else. So knowing where your pressure gauge is on your pressure tank, knowing that you have a pressure tank, knowing that you have a well versus your municipal system, these are things that make it much more efficient to get the help you need, where you need it, when you need it. The whole system works a lot faster if you've got a basic working knowledge of what these things are.
Right. So empowering homeowners. That's what we're here for.
Absolutely. I cannot imagine the millions of dollars that are lost every year on service work or trade work that was not the correct tradesperson to get down to the root of a problem.
Right.